What would you give up to hold on to the one thing that was never supposed to be yours? And what if giving it up was the only way to prove you deserved it? This is a story about a woman who restored a crumbling mansion and a man who didn't realize he needed saving too, and it shows that the wait, even when it hurts, can absolutely be worth it. The morning Eleanor Voss arrived at Whitmore Hall, the iron gate was rusted open and the driveway was full of dead leaves that no one had bothered to sweep. She sat behind the wheel of her rented car and looked at the house for a long moment. 3 stories. Georgian architecture. A right wing that was clearly sinking. And somewhere behind those tall windows, a man who had already decided to demolish everything she was about to fight for. Eleanor was 34 years old and the best architectural preservationist in Edinburgh. She had saved a Victorian textile mill, a collapsed pier in Aberdeen, and a Baroque chapel that half the city had written off as rubble. She had never failed a building. She had, however, failed a marriage. And the quiet of the Scottish countryside in the autumn of 2019 felt uncomfortably close to the quiet that had filled her flat in the months after the divorce. Too much space. Too much time to think. She grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car. Daniel Whitmore opened the front door before she could knock. He was taller than she had expected from the photographs in the legal file. Dark hair that needed cutting. A jaw set in the particular way of someone who has already made up his mind and is waiting, with diminishing patience, for the rest of the world to catch up. He looked at her the way people look at someone they didn't ask for. His great-aunt had left the estate to a preservation trust, with one condition: the trust had 18 months to assess restoration viability. If Eleanor declared the project viable and secured funding, the house would be saved. If she declared it lost, ownership reverted to Daniel, and he could finally sell it and close the chapter of his family's history that he seemed to want very much to close. He offered her tea in a kitchen where 3 of the ceiling tiles were water-stained and 1 window was sealed with plastic sheeting and tape. She accepted the tea and did not comment on the ceiling. They established the rules quickly. She would have full access to the property. He would remain in the east wing, which was structurally sound, while she conducted her assessment. She would not ask him to participate. He would not interfere with her work. He agreed to everything with the efficiency of a man who wanted her work done and over. The first week, she documented damage. The second week, she started understanding the house. The third week, she understood that the house had been loved, deeply, obsessively, continuously, and then abandoned all at once, like someone had simply stopped in the middle of a sentence. She found botanical sketches framed in the upstairs hallway. Handwritten plant labels in the greenhouse, still legible. A small music room where someone had left sheet music open on the stand, the edges brown with age, but the pages still intact. She did not see Daniel much in those first weeks. He worked remotely for a London architecture firm, which struck her as ironic given what he wanted to do to this building. He ate alone. He walked the grounds in the early evening, always the same path along the west wall, hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing in particular. They began talking by accident. She was on a ladder in the library one evening, cataloging the condition of the upper shelves, when she heard him come in looking for a specific volume. He didn't ask her to move. He waited. She came down the ladder and found the book for him in under a minute. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it. They talked about the book. Then about the library. Then about the structural logic of the room, which was better than it appeared, and Daniel said something technically precise about load-bearing walls that made her stop and look at him properly for the first time. She asked him what he specialized in at the firm. He told her, adaptive reuse of historic structures. She didn't say anything for a moment. He looked out the window and said quietly that it was different when it was someone else's building. Things shifted after that. Not dramatically. Just slightly, like a door that has always been stuck finally moving on its hinge. They began having dinner in the kitchen 2 or 3 times a week. The conversations moved slowly at first, professional, careful. Then they started talking about other things. About the strange grief of inheriting a place you never lived in. About what it meant to save something versus preserving the illusion of it. About her divorce, which she mentioned once, briefly, and he didn't press. About his mother, who had died when he was 12, in this house, and whom his great-aunt had essentially become, and whose death 3 years ago had started the clock on his need to be done with Whitmore once and for all. That was when Eleanor began to understand. The house wasn't just a legal inconvenience for him. It was a place where everyone he loved had eventually disappeared. Staying meant remembering. Selling meant being allowed, finally, to stop. She understood that kind of logic. She had moved to Edinburgh after the divorce specifically to be somewhere that held none of her history. She also understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she was starting to look forward to the evenings in that cold kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with the building. In November, the Trust's preliminary funding committee visited the estate. Eleanor gave her assessment. The structure was more sound than it appeared, the architectural significance was undeniable, the costs were high but justifiable. She recommended full restoration. The committee was encouraged. Daniel sat in the back of the room during her presentation and said nothing. That night he didn't come to the kitchen. The next morning she found him in the greenhouse, standing among the dead plants and the handwritten labels. She almost left him alone. Instead she went in. He told her about the woman who had written those labels. His great-aunt Clara, who had spent 60 years caring for this estate after inheriting it from a husband who had preferred the London clubs to the Scottish countryside. Who had told Daniel, when he was a boy, that a place remembered the people who loved it. Then he told Eleanor something she hadn't known. Clara had written to the Preservation Trust 3 years before her death, when she was already ill. She had specifically requested that the Trust send someone young and, as Clara had written in the letter, someone who had recently lost something and might understand what it means to try to get it back. The Trust director had told Eleanor she was selected for her expertise. Which was also true. But it wasn't the whole truth. Eleanor stood very still in the greenhouse and replayed the last 2 months. Clara had not chosen her randomly. Clara had read her professional history, yes, but also an interview Eleanor had given after the divorce, in an architectural magazine, where she had talked about how working with old buildings helped her believe that broken things could still become something whole. Clara had sent for her specifically. And Daniel had known this since Eleanor's first day. The anger came quickly. She walked out of the greenhouse, back through the house, to her temporary office in the East Wing, and she closed the door with more force than she intended. She felt managed. Arranged. Like a piece in someone else's plan. She considered, seriously, calling the Trust director and withdrawing from the project. She had enough documentation to pass the assessment to a colleague. She could be in Edinburgh by nightfall. She sat at her desk for a long time. Then she thought about the music room. The open sheet music. The botanical labels in Clara's handwriting. She thought about what Clara had actually done, found 2 people who had stopped believing that the things they loved could be repaired, and put them in a house that proved otherwise every day, if they were willing to look. It wasn't manipulation. It was an act of extraordinary and slightly meddling hope. She was still angry, but she understood it. She didn't leave. She and Daniel did not speak for 4 days. He respected the distance without being told. She noticed that too. When they did finally talk, it was late on a Thursday, and he came to the door of her office and leaned against the frame and said he was sorry he hadn't told her. He said he hadn't known how, and then it had gone on too long, and he had been afraid that if she knew she'd leave, and he had not wanted her to leave. He said that last part to the floor. Then he looked at her. She asked him what he wanted to happen with the house. A long pause. Then he said he didn't want to sell it anymore. That somewhere between October and now, he had stopped wanting that. But he didn't know what he wanted instead. And that frightened him. She said she knew the feeling exactly. In January, the funding consortium made their formal offer. Restoration would take 4 years. The trust would manage the project. And they wanted Eleanor to lead it, which would mean relocating, at least part-time, for the duration. She had 72 hours to decide. She knew what she wanted to say. The problem was that she wasn't sure if she wanted it for the right reasons, or whether the right reasons even mattered anymore, or whether she had spent so long being careful and correct that she had forgotten what it felt like to choose something simply because it was where she wanted to be. On the second night of those 72 hours, Daniel knocked on her door and asked if she wanted to walk the grounds. It was cold. The kind of cold that makes everything sharp and clear. They walked the west wall, his usual path, and she understood for the first time why he walked it. From that angle, in the right light, the south facade of the house looked exactly as it must have looked 100 years ago. Perfect. Unhurt. He told her that he had called the trust director that afternoon. He had told them that whatever Eleanor decided, the estate was no longer for sale. He was going to be involved in the restoration, not as owner but as consulting architect. He had already spoken to his firm. She looked at him. He said he needed her to know that he had made that decision before knowing what she would choose. It wasn't a condition. It wasn't a way to keep her there. He just thought she deserved to know the house would be cared for either way. And then he said nothing else. He didn't ask. He didn't lean in. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets in the winter dark and let her have the silence. She said yes to the project. And then, after a beat, to everything else that the word was large enough to contain. He smiled in the slow way of someone who has not let himself hope for something in a very long time. The restoration of Whitmore Hall took 4 years and 3 months. Eleanor led the project from Edinburgh, with 6 weeks on site every quarter. Daniel drove up from London on most of the weeks she was there. By the second year, he had transferred to a Glasgow office. By the third year, he was no longer commuting. The music room was completed in the spring of the fourth year. A pianist from the local conservatoire came to play at the opening. The sheet music that had been on the stand, a Schubert impromptu, had been carefully preserved and returned to its place. The night of the opening, after the guests had gone, Eleanor stood in the center of that room and listened to the particular silence of a house that has been returned to itself. Daniel came to stand beside her. He took her hand without making anything of it, the way you do when something has long since been decided. The hall opened to the public the following autumn. In the guest book, on the first page, someone on the trust staff had written Clara Whitmore's name. Below it, over time, thousands of others would add their own. Eleanor and Daniel were married in the garden the following June. Small ceremony. The greenhouse had been fully restored by then, the plants growing back slowly in their labeled beds, exactly as they had been.